Well, good evening and a very warm welcome. My name is Bill Kepper and I am co-chair of the Diversity Awareness Committee. We'd like to begin by thanking all those who have gone before us and cleared our path, especially the Duwamish tribe, whose land upon which we now stand. This evening it's my pleasure to introduce Tarek Dawoud. Tarek Dawoud is a member of the Muslim Association of Puget Sound's Interfaith and Outreach Committee. He is a community activist who has lived in the Seattle area for the past 23 years. He is a graduate of the Cairo University Computer Engineering Department, and he came to the United States from Egypt early 2001 and works in the software industry. Tarek served as president of the Washington State chapter of the Council on American Islamic Relations, the largest Muslim civil rights advocacy group, which he served for 9 years. He has served as president of the Interfaith and Outreach Committee for 4 years. So it is my pleasure to introduce Tarek Dawoud.
Okay, testing, is it low? Is it good? Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Bill, for the kind introduction, and good evening, everyone. My name is Tarek Dawoud, as I mentioned. I'm originally from Egypt, for those of you who are curious. I grew up there, lived for 8 years in Saudi Arabia in my childhood, if you're interested about that country. And then I went back to Egypt and graduated college, worked for a few years, and then was hired by Microsoft and came here in 2001. I'm married, I have a wife, I have a daughter, and a stepdaughter, and they are both college age, 20 and 19. Okay, so today we're going to do two things. On the one hand, I'll kind of try to teach you the basics of the faith, how Muslims look at themselves. And then we're going to go through a very fast, for 1400 years, we're going to go read and try to fit it in 14 minutes, kind of trip of kind of overall view of Muslim history, the big milestones. Again, there is a map somewhere near the end of this slides where we will go show the Muslim world and how big it is. And so the history I'm telling you is kind of fairly Middle East centric as well. If you maybe talk to a Muslim from Indonesia, they may not be their worldview at all. For them, maybe Islam showed up, 700 years ago, and there was the island, and they were happy in the island, and then the Dutch showed up one day, and that's their history. Is a very different thing. So, back here, this is more kind of how what do you call it? How Muslims kind of view their faith. So the first thing I want to cover is kind of the pillars of the faith. These are things that a Muslim must believe in. Islam has a very strange thing, which is that despite being 1.6 billion people around the world, despite never having been ruled by the same ruler at all, like for example, the Muslims in Senegal and the Muslims in West China, have never been under the same rule ever, right? There are some of these things that are very uniform across the religion, despite never been under the same ruler or school of thought or clergy or anything like that. So a part of that comes from the centrality of the Quran, which we'll talk about in this. So these things, when I say them, they're not my opinion, they're not just my mosque, they're not my denomination. Literally, this is every Muslim in the world thinks that you have to believe in those 6 things. The next slide is going to be, you have to do those 5 things, because the pillars of practice. And you'll find Muslims who don't pray. You'll find Muslims who don't fast. We'll get to that in the next slide. Yes, ma'am. Yes, I will try to speak a little more slowly as well. So you will find Muslims who don't fast. You will find Muslims who don't pray. But they will not argue that a Muslim shouldn't fast. That in their version of Islam, a Muslim doesn't fast. And so that's what I'm saying. So it's not that everybody does these things, but that everybody believes they are part of the faith. Cool. So These are the things you have to believe in. Obviously, central to the Islamic tradition is belief in God. So Muslims see themselves as a continuation of monotheistic religions. They don't think they're the first edition of a new religion or everybody else before them was wrong. Muslims see themselves as first, their humanity in general was monotheistic. Over time, they would swerve. They would go off the beaten path. Some would worship idols. Some would stop worshiping anything. Some would worship themselves. And God would send messengers over time. So Islam is one of the very few religions in the world who consider other traditions to have truth in them. So for example, we actually believe Judaism came from God. We believe Christianity came from God. Where of course Christians and Jews who disagree with us is we think we are the latest edition of that same religion. We have a verse in the Quran, our holy book, that says, we have sent a messenger to every nation. Which means that I cannot go to a Native American and say, there's not a grain of truth in your faith. I can't say that. Because in my tradition it says they had a messenger from God and some of their wisdom comes from God, even if I disagree with some other parts of it. Makes sense? There was an angry right-wing priest in Florida who was burning Qurans to anger Muslims. This was during the Trump years, 2016-17. A Muslim who's very angry at him cannot go and burn the Bible. Why? We believe the Bible is a holy book. We actually cannot completely dismiss it or harm it or disrespect it in any way, shape, or form. So that's something I want you to understand about how we look about our relationship with the fact that religion came from God, that God is one throughout all these traditions. And of course, for us, God is the perfection of all that is good. He is the creator. He is the sustainer of the world. He is involved in creation. He didn't just set the world in motion and is just watching from afar. He's involved in everyday life and everyday justices and injustices that are happening. We have many names for God, and we have many attributes for God. So for us, God is unlike any of his creation. So he's not some big old man in the sky or woman or person of any type. He is unlike, that's how he describes himself in the Quran. We actually even use the pronoun he because he uses it, not because it means male or female. In Arabic, it also means the indefinite unseen. That's also the same way we use it. So he describes himself as being unlike any of his creation. So I can't assume he has a hand. I can't assume he's big, small, none of these things. And so how do we know him then? And so the way we know him is through his names and his attributes. He lists those in the Quran. Prophet Muhammad teaches us some of these. Some of them are in the older traditions. For example, he is the one. Meaning, if there was a God, there would be only one. Logically, if there were two, each of them would have their own creation, and the two creations would not work together. He is the first. If there was a God, he'd have to be the first. If he was the second, who made the first thing? If he was, right? Who sustains that thing before he showed up, right? And he's also the last. If there's something that can outlast him, what's that? Maybe that's God, right? So those are names of God. And then the other side of that, we have his behaviors, how he describes how he behaves in the universe. He says he is the oft forgiving. He is the merciful. He is the graceful. He is the just. He is the powerful. So this is how he chose to describe himself. The Quran has 114 chapters. Each of them starts with a blessing. The blessing is in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. This is how he chose to open every chapter in the book. He did not choose to put on display his power. In the name of God, the most powerful, the most terrifying. He chose to use the terms of mercy and grace. So this is how we know how he prefers to act in the world. Does not mean he's not capable of punishment, does not mean he's not capable of justice, or all these things. It's just this is how he chose to describe himself. So this is how we know God. By the way, this is open discussion. If there's something that does not make sense, when you want to ask questions, feel free to interrupt me during the presentation. It's just that if we start running out of time, I may start nudging us faster because we only have 1 hour. So I'll keep this to make sure I keep an eye on time. The second pillar of faith is angels. I'll get back to this one in a second. The third pillar of faith ties back to this image we have of the history of the world, is that throughout time God would send prophets to mankind to correct them whenever they would swerve, whenever they'd go wrong. Some nation may become tyrannical, abusive to their neighbors. Some nation may forget about God worship. Some nation may start enslaving the nations around them. And so God would send messengers to correct them, as he did with Moses and Pharaoh. For us, all these messengers were trying to correct nations that were going, either the belief system was wrong or these rules in society were going wrong. And some of the names of the prophets I'm going to list are absolutely known to you or familiar to you from the Old Testament or the New Testament. So we believe of Abraham, Moses, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. These names are all familiar to all of you, I hope, or most of you. And sometimes these messengers would be accompanied with revealed scriptures. So starting from Abraham onward, humanity was civilized enough to write, and write in script that can be moved from somewhere, not on walls like my people did in Egypt, which was very hard to move around, but actually on paper and with a script that can be easily read. And so then messengers started coming with holy books, such as we actually believe the Torah is those are named in the Quran. This is not an opinion. The Quran says the Torah came from God. The Quran says the Psalms of David came from, those are two books in the Old Testament. And then the Gospel of Jesus. Not the entire New Testament, the Gospels of the four Gospels of Jesus, the story of Jesus and the teachings. We actually believe all of these are coming from God. And of course we believe in the Quran. And the Quran came with the final messenger, Prophet Muhammad. And it is, for Muslims, the literal word of God. It is not like the Gospel. Meaning the Gospel is the story of Jesus as told by his companions and his teachings. And we absolutely believe he's speaking for God when he speaks, right? But for us, the equivalent is the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. Those are preserved in a separate book. The Quran is when Prophet Muhammad would say, write these down, these are from God. People would write them down, and that's the Quran. So when we open the book and read it, it's not Muhammad saying these things. To us, it's actually God saying these things. So just something to understand. We believe in a day of judgment in which everybody who's ever lived on this planet will be brought back to life, stand before God for account, give an account for their lives, and then be rewarded with heaven or hell. And we believe in an actual heaven and an actual hell. And then we believe in divine destiny, which is that life is a mix of choices and things that are predetermined by God and things that we have free will to react to, and that's what we're held accountable to. So, as a simple example, how many of you here chose your parents? Hopefully, yep. How many of you would say that your parents had a huge impact on who you are today? Right? There's just the accent, the way you talk, the way you walk, very small things, socioeconomic status, you build up on that, right? Ethnic background, culture, all these things. And this is the deck of cards. For example, this is part of the deck of cards you were dealt. God would never hold you accountable for why were you blonde? Why were you tall? Why were you speaking in a British accent, right? He will hold you accountable for you were given this gift or test. How did you respond to it? So you were born handsome. You discover that when you talk to people, they listen to you. And so you try to charm them into buying laptops. That's okay. That's neither good nor evil, for example. You try to con them out of their retirement money. That's a sin. God will not be happy with that. You try to call them to do good action and do good deeds. You'll be rewarded for that. So that's kind of how we look at divine destiny versus free will. Back to angels. So angels are a pillar of faith because they are a pillar of our faith is to believe in the unseen. That there are things outside of our ability to touch, to interact with, to judge as human beings, that God is so powerful that he can create things out of our ability to sense them, to interact with them. We don't worship angels. We don't direct anything towards angels. We just believe in angels because God says in the Holy Book that he has these invisible servants doing his bidding everywhere and enacting his will, taking note of our deeds, all these things. We believe it simply because it's in the Quran. And so it's a matter of faith because it's a matter of humility to God, that not everything has to be sensed and touched by our senses to be real. So, That's that. Any questions on the pillars of faith before I go to the next slide? Okay. Pillars of practice, as I mentioned, these are the 5 things you should do to be a practicing Muslim. You will find Muslims who do not do 1, 2, 5, hopefully 4 of the 5. The first one should be easy. The first one is a declaration of faith. This is to enter the faith. You need to simply make a statement, which is actually, this is Arabic calligraphy up there in the top right. It says there's no one worthy of worship but God, capital G, and that Prophet Muhammad is a messenger of God. Not the only messenger, but a messenger of God. This is what someone says to enter the faith. They don't say it to anyone, for the record. They don't have to say it to a priest or an imam or anybody. They just have to believe it in their heart, declare the faith. It is recommended that someone says that in the presence of others so that they are your witnesses in case you write in your will, I need to be buried according to Islamic law, and your kids are like, what is he talking about? That there will be others who witness the fact, for example, that someone converted to Islam. But most born Muslims like myself, we've said it like 14,000 times by the time we're, puberty, so we're not required to say it. There's no baptism, there's no bar mitzvah at a certain coming of age to be, become fully started practicing the faith. There's no such thing. It's just you're assumed you're in it if you've been saying it and you believe it. The first one is praying 5 times a day. That's what you see this gentleman down here doing. We pray 5 times a day. We pray at dawn, high noon, afternoon, sunset, and evening. Each prayer is about 5 to 7 minutes. We repeat a cycle in which we stand, then we bow, then we rise, then we prostrate, then we sit, and then we stand again. That's one cycle. And each prayer, some prayers are 2 cycles, some prayers are 4 cycles. That's it. What we say during the prayers is we worship God, we glorify Him, we praise Him, and then you can add anything else you want. You can pray for health, pray for your sick child, pray for an exam. That's all fine, but you have to say the minimum is to say these words of praising God, because it's a daily reminder. It's basically every 3 hours reminder that it's not just about this world. It's about the connection to God. So I remember I was in a church and I was saying that, I was describing the prayer, and someone says, doesn't it get in the way of meetings? Yes. Doesn't it get in the way of meetings? And yes, and that is the intent. And so, just to be clear, the noon prayer comes in at high noon. It expires at 3 p.m. or 5 p.m. You have 4 or 5. You don't have to just jump in the middle of a meeting and run out and pray. You have 5 hours before, but you should find this 5-minute spot to go out to a quiet place and pray. Because the whole point is to get you to settle down, think about the big picture, and not just, I'm angry at this guy in the meeting. I'm going to prove myself who's wrong. I'm going to win this argument. I'm going to fire this guy. You calm down, you kind of resettle, you refocus yourself on the bigger picture. So we pray those 5 times. We pray facing Mecca. Anybody has any idea where Mecca is from Seattle? What are you pointing? Oh, that way is east? The Middle East, exactly. East of where? East of Seattle. East. So on a rectangular map, it is east. But the earth is a sphere. And so the shortest distance between Seattle and Mecca is north-northeast. So it's actually 18 degrees. Yeah. So if you fly to Mecca, the shortest path is to go straight over, like I just flew Turkish Air to Cairo, and it was straight to Istanbul, and like straight south of it was Mecca right away. And so, yes. So anyways, so that's just a cute, small little tidbit. We pray north-northeast and not east. That's prayers. Next, we have to, as Muslims, we have to give a fraction of our wealth every year to the needy. I'm going to unpack that sentence. A fraction, 2.5% of our wealth, that's our savings, not our income. So if you're living hand to mouth, if you're a teacher and they're giving you, $60,000, $70,000 a year, you're barely getting through just the years providing rent and food for your kids, you owe nothing. It's if you have savings and they're above $5,000, then you start paying 2.5% on the savings every year. So, and it goes to the most needy in society. It's called zakat in Arabic. And it goes to the most needy. It doesn't go to a church, doesn't go to build a bridge, doesn't go to build a school, goes to the homeless. And if your society has no homeless, go to the people who have a hard time paying bills or medical bills. And then if you don't have those, then you start maybe building schools or stuff like that. And so that's how it's structured. If this is regular money, if you do work for the earnings you make. For example, if you farm your own land and you grow the crops and you irrigate the crops, you give 2.5% of the crops. But if you rely more on God, for example, irrigation of your crops is natural rain, you don't do much for it, you just watch, you plant the crops and you just let the rain irrigate it, for example, you pay 10%. So the more lucky you are in terms of the amount of labor you have to do, the more you have to pay back. The more hard work you put in, the less you have to pay, but you have to pay some certain amount. So that's the almsgiving or zakat. Yes?
Is there a notion?
I'll repeat it. Or if you want to talk to the mic, please, thank you.
Is there a notion of merit in that third pillar? If I give more than the required percentage, do I get a step up at the day of judgment?
So this is the minimum you have to give. To be a Muslim, to qualify, this is just to qualify as a good Muslim, you have to do this. To your point, you can give as much extra as you want, and of course, the more you give, the more you'll be rewarded. The harder it is to give, the more you'll be rewarded. So if you make 70,000 a year and you give 5,000, that goes much further than someone who makes $1 million a year and gives 50,000, for example. And so, but yes, there is obviously, the more you give, the better, and we're actually encouraged to give and give. Sneak back to the camera. Sorry, yes, I promised her I'd stay behind the podium. Apologies. So that was a good question, thank you. Fourth is fasting the month of Ramadan. So the month of Ramadan was actually last month, April. So actually started in the end of March, went all the way to 20th of April. The month of Ramadan is a holy month that comes by according to a lunar calendar. How many of you think the Jewish calendar is a lunar calendar? How many of you think the Chinese calendar is a lunar calendar? Okay, well, I have a surprise for you. Both calendars are a luni-solar calendar. The Islamic calendar is a purely lunar calendar. What does that mean? A little bit of math for the math fanatics in the room. Purely lunar means you just go by 12 months of the cycles of the moon. You don't look at the sun at all. Right? So full moon, crescent, full complete darkness all the way back. That actually is 354 days a year. The year is 354 days. The solar year is 365. So if you go by a purely lunar calendar, what's going to happen is your months are going to move back earlier, 11 days every year. And that's what happens with Ramadan. Ramadan moves every year. The Jewish and Chinese calendars are lunisolar, meaning that those societies, as they started taking a dependency on the sun for crops, they wanted to snap their months, have the same, January always be the first, in winter, and blah be in the summer, so they can plant crops and things around that. So what they do is they stuff extra days every few years, such that Chinese New Year always arrives around February, right? End of January, beginning of February. Why? If it was a purely lunar calendar, it would keep moving, and it will come in the summer and the winter, like our fasting months do. The reason it moves is because it's a lunar. Same thing with the Jewish calendar. You notice Hanukkah always arrives around a certain time, right? Passover, because of the fact that they add that. Just a small tidbit. But our calendar is purely lunar, so our months move. So Ramadan does not stay in the same place. Next year it will be beginning of March. Year after will be mid-February. When I first came here in America, it was November. It was paradise. You had breakfast at 6:30. It was still not dawn yet, because we abstained from eating and drinking from dawn, so before sunrise, all the way till sunset during Ramadan. And so in the winter, you wake up at 6:30, you have breakfast just fine, you skip lunch and you have dinner at 5 and you're fine. And so it was really beautiful. In the summer, it was brutal. So now it's almost all the way back to, it basically will complete a full circle in 33 years. So I guess 10 more years I'll be back where I started. So, yes, and the purpose of Ramadan, this is a family breaking the fast. I'm not going to leave the podium. is self-control. Ultimately, it's about being God mindfulness for us. God prescribes the reason for fasting in the Quran as being about being mindful of God and being able to control yourself and submit to the desires, submit to the will of God. And the way any human is challenged by something that God demands, that they feel tempted to disobey, is to learn self-discipline, right? So I'm a person who likes to look at women. Well, what's the solution for it? Is that I try and practice self-control and so forth. It's not simply that I follow my desires. How do I do that? Ramadan helps us because your most basic need is food, and you learn to control and not submit to your urge and kind of hold on until the time to break the fast. It also connects us to the poor, because our hunger is like the hunger of the poor person in the street. They're hungry at 2 p.m., they're hungry at 8 a.m., but they can only eat at 5 p.m. when the soup kitchen, or whatever. 2 p.m., whenever the soup kitchen opens, that's when they can eat. Same thing for us. I'm hungry the whole day, and I can only eat when. The last pillar of practice is pilgrimage to Mecca, and we have to do this one once in a lifetime. And so when you're able, physically and financially, you're supposed to go to Mecca, the same place we prayed towards, that was east. And we reenact the journey of Abraham when he brought his son Ishmael and his second wife Hagar, and he left them there. We reenact that rituals and the story of the family there. And it's all about sacrifice and obedience to God against all hardship, basically. It's about a week, the journey, actually, but most people take 2 weeks. Just they spend a few days in the holy sites and whatever, before and after. And it's a very grueling journey, despite airplanes and accommodations and the Saudi government spending millions of dollars on a transit system and a thing system and all that stuff. It's still very difficult. It's 2.5 million people walking from point A to point B, and then buses from point B to point C. It's actually very, very hard. And this is the journey that transformed Malcolm X. So we were talking about earlier about Malcolm X. This is the journey that transformed Malcolm X from the Nation of Islam to mainstream Islam, when he went there and he saw white Muslims from Bosnia, from Turkey, and they're blue-eyed and blonde, and he discovered that the problem was not necessarily the white man per se, and so. Cool. And this is a picture from the pilgrimage. This picture I put there because as you approach the perimeter of Mecca, you are required to change into simple clothing. Like, see these women, there's no deviation in color, there's no flashiness, there's no different embroidery style, anything like that. Even though if you've ever seen Middle Eastern women in the style of dress, they love embroidery, for example, right? But as you approach Mecca, you're not allowed, and as a pilgrim, you can't come in until you've changed to very simple garbs. The men literally wear like a piece of cloth around their waist and another one around their upper body, and that's it. Because it's a massively equalizing experience. You can't tell who's rich, who's poor, who's a politician, who's a whatever. Everybody has to be equal before God when they walk in there. And so it's a very powerful, no gold watch, no telltale signs of how rich or not so rich you are. So, now we'll go to the history lesson. So, those were the pillars of faith, pillars of practice. Any questions on these things? Anything? Any of you saw a Muslim doing any of these things and had questions about them? Yes.
Now, I'm curious about the 5 prayers a day. And you kind of alluded to the fact that because we live so far north, like that, not only does the Ramadan move around because of the lunar calendar, but the time of day that sunrise and sunset is much more extreme than if you live close to the equator.
Correct.
So how do Muslims deal with that in this latitude versus if you were in the Middle East where you're almost on the equator?
Excellent question. So it does. So over there, the curse is that it's hot in the summer and the winter. Here, the curse, as you exactly said, is in the summer, the days are very long, and the winter days, as I mentioned in November, are beautifully short. It is a challenge, however, and our Muslim scholars have debated over this. The cut line, unfortunately, we're right above the cut line. The cut line is 50 latitude. So if you live north of 50 latitude, you measure to the closest 50 latitude city. So yes, so we're just under it, so we have to follow the sun. So for example, in the summer, sunset is at 9:30, and we fast till 9:30. It's hard, and to be fair, if you can't, you can't. So for example, to your example, my daughters, they were 10 when this was happening, when Ramadan was in July. So this was like 10 years ago, and they wanted to fast, super excited. Kids, it's like Christmas for them. Kids are so excited, they want to fast, they're going to do it, right? And then they try to fast, and both of them started having cramps, cramps in their legs, which is a sign of dehydration. So we just made them stop after 2-3 days. And it's, okay, just break your fast. What we do is you say break your fast at 4. It's okay. And then we keep going. The 5 prayers a day is fine. You just move. Yeah, I mean, in the evening prayer is not 10:30. She asked what about the 5 prayers? Are they also difficult in the summer versus the winter? In the winter, it's hard because they move by so fast. Like you're at work, and you literally, if you take your eye off the clock, you can literally miss the noon prayer because between 12 and 4, the noon and the sunset, and the afternoon and the sunset prayer all got smushed together. But we deal with it. And then in the summer, the opposite. The night prayer is at 10:30, and the dawn prayer is at 3. And so you wake up in the middle of the night, pray, and then go back to sleep. And so it is challenging. But north of a certain latitude, you can start approximating to easier time zones. I think I had yes, behind you over there. Or I can repeat the question if you want.
I love your shirt.
Yes.
Okay, I have 2 questions. Look, do women and men both pray 5 times a day?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
The second question is, looking at his position and thinking about my body, do you accommodate for older people? Because that's a pretty incredible position he's in.
You have to work on your yoga. I'm just kidding. No, great question. So first of all, women and men both pray. Actually, to your point, I think specifically, women during the menstruation cycle are not required to pray. Not supposed. They can pray like oh God, like just pray to God, but they don't have to do the 5 daily prayers. And then the prostration and the movements, even the bowing. If you ever come to our mosque, MAPS in Redmond, which I invite you maybe to do a group tour together, we do tours actually. You'll see that there's a section of chairs in the back because there's a number of elderly in our community who also are not as nimble. So yes, of course, yeah. Everything, I mean, just about every teaching in Islam, all of them is basically what you can. Just like the pilgrimage, just like the giving alms, all that stuff. I'm speaking too fast. I'm sorry. I apologize. I will slow down. If you want me to repeat that last part, it's just, okay, we're good? Okay, I will try to slow down. Okay, so now we're the history part. So this is how Muslims view history in general. This is big picture. Oneness of God means oneness of mankind, oneness of creation. There's no part of creation that we're afraid to look at. There's no part of creation that is not by God. The devil did not create anything. The devil is not underground. The devil does not own any dominion over anything. All of it is from God. The ugly looking insect that you don't like and the beautiful flower that you absolutely love, everything is from God. And so I mentioned that because oneness of mankind is also an important thing. We do not believe in like, oh, this is a good race and this is a bad race, or this is a good people, these are bad people. Everybody's from God. They all came from the same source. Oneness of creation, the implication of what I said is that for Muslims, when Islam came to them, it brought civilization and science. Like some Christian in the West, especially in America and in Western Europe, have challenges with Christian faith because in the minds of some of them, all the Dark Ages, the medieval times was the time of the church, and then Renaissance and the time of reason, we rebelled against the church. Therefore, they sometimes associate religiosity with backwardness. For Muslims, it was kind of the other way around. The original Muslims that Prophet Muhammad was sent to were Bedouin tribes. living in the Arabian Peninsula, just not very significant in the world events. And then with Islam, with this call to explore the world, all the world is God's, go ahead and explore it, right? They started exploring, learning from the Greeks, learning from the Persians, learning from the Romans, and started documenting sciences. And within 150 years, the most civilized nation in the world was a Muslim nation. So it's just a different perspective on history. A lot of Muslims don't have the same conflicted view that some Westerners have towards religion and science, for example. They simply see the two as coexisting. So it's something that's an interesting implication of this worldview and the way history played out is are just different in many Muslims' minds. I'm not saying this to claim that there is no conflict between science and religion. Sometimes there is. I'm just saying for many folks in the Muslim world, they don't see the two necessarily at conflict. Story of world creation. We basically believe that God created the world and that the earth is bazillions of years old, and then humans were put on it at some point. And we don't have a problem with evolution between certain species and so forth, but we do not believe humans necessarily evolved from it. We believe there was a point in which humans were put on earth. I mentioned same religions throughout history, prophets to all nations, and then Muslims see themselves as a continuation of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition. We see Christ as a reformer of Judaism, and we see Muhammad as a reformer of Judaism and Christianity. Question, yes, please. Mike, or I can.
What do you do when you're confronted with what other traditions would call evil?
What do you do when you're confronted with what other traditions are called evil? I don't quite understand what other traditions would call evil, if you can expand on that.
Well, Christians have Satan and embodiments of evil. What does a Muslim do when confronted with evil?
It's interesting. So our world,
Do you recognize that evil exists?
of course, but evil is the acts of creatures with free will. It's not a separate power source or thing that exists in its own. So for example, for us, Satan is a creature of free will. He does exist in the Islamic tradition. He's a creature of free will, and he was there before Adam, and when God created Adam, he was jealous and he was prideful. The story of his exile from heaven is documented on it's not a fallen angel. Angels don't have free will in our tradition. So angels are servants of the light. They will never change. However, he was a spirit that was there in the heavens, and when God gave the commandment for everyone to bow to Adam, he refused. And the dialogue between them is very interesting because it's a lesson for us in Islam about pride and envy and jealousy and all these things. So God asks him, even though God knows, asks him, why did you not prostrate to Adam when I gave the command for all to prostrate? He said, I am better than him. I am made of fire, and he is made of clay, of mud, this ugly, thick, slow creature, and I can fly and go through walls, and what is this thing? And so he was the first racist in a way, right? And so God said, then you will have to leave. There is no place for prideful, arrogant people in heaven. He says, then I have a favor to ask you. God says, ask. This is very interesting. He didn't ask for forgiveness. What did he ask for? He said, give me time. Don't let me die. Give me time until you take them all back, meaning until the end of the human experiment or existence on earth. God said, you are, and watch his cowardice. God says, you are granted this wish. Then he reveals his true intent, as if God doesn't know. So then he says, then I shall work super hard to lead as many of them astray as I can, and take them all to hell with me. So it's jealousy and pettiness. But it's a lesson because this is, in many ways, this is how sometimes humans act when they're prideful. Right? You do something wrong, someone says, hey, you did something wrong. A person, instead of simply saying, oh, sorry, my mistake. And God teaches that in the rest of the story of creation for us, is that after he's gone, he's exiled from heaven, he sneaks back. And he starts to whisper. The power that Satan has over us is he has the power of whispering to us. We can't see him, but he can see us. So he whispers to Adam, and he keeps saying to Adam and Eve, eat from the tree, eat from the tree. God told them, live in the garden. The one thing you can't do is eat from that tree. Everything else is okay. And it's a test of obedience and free will, right? And so they're eating, they're living happily, and then there's this thing whispering to them, eat from the tree. We don't have a snake, we don't have the whole thing, but and we don't blame Eve or any of that stuff, we don't have that version. But they both eat from the tree. Actually, the verse actually says, both of them ate from it. It does not say Adam ate from it, it does say Eve tempted Adam, none of that stuff. So they ate from it, and the moment they ate from it, God asked them the exact same dialogue. God says, why did you eat from the tree when I commanded you not to eat from the tree? The difference is Adam says, oh my Lord, we have committed a grief sin, please forgive us. He says, you are also exiled from heaven. You'll have to go and live on earth, which was always their final destination. But then now you've learned sin, mistakes, forgiveness, pride. You've seen the whole thing now. Adam actually saw the original cut scene with Satan, and now he saw. So this is how we see it. We see that evil is the actions of creatures with free will. It's not just a thing that's happening, always trying to take over the world. Very great question. Thank you. So I'm going to go to the next slide. So Prophet Muhammad, this is the main prophet in our tradition. He was born in Mecca. He was a respected young Meccan man, noble family, not rich himself. So he had to work as a shepherd in his younger years. Then he started running caravans for other wealthier people. One of them was the woman who was to become his wife. She was a wealthy woman. She hired him. She loved his trustworthiness and his honesty, and she actually proposed to him. And then they got married, and then they had 4 or 5 kids. And then at the age of 40, he used to take solitude and go to a mountain and try to worship the creator of the world. He did not agree with his people's worship of idols and statues and stuff like that, but he had no religion. So he would just go to the mountain and try to pray to the creator of the universe. And over there, the angel Gabriel came down to him and revealed what we believe is the first Quran. So this is how we see it. At that point, he started calling on his closest friends. Obviously, he came home to his wife. His wife was his first supporter and believer. He started talking to his friends, his relatives, and he had a small following. After a few years, God commanded him to go public. And so he went to that cube building in Mecca, and he actually stood right there where all the idols were. Back then, they had a bunch of idols around it. And he said, I am a messenger from God. And they booed him and chased him away, and so forth. And from then, the struggle became public. There was persecution, similar to all the other prophets. So just like Jesus faced, even though he had clear arguments, forget about miracles, just clear arguments of what he's calling for, like there should be no slavery, there should be fairness, there should be justice, care for the poor, believe in one God, and the whole universe is coherent, it's not coming from different gods. Still, he was fought, he was opposed by the most powerful and wealthy in society, unfortunately, as it sometimes is. And eventually it got to a place where they basically planned his assassination, and then he was commanded to leave Mecca. So he took his companion, left Mecca to a nearby city called Medina, which this suburb of Medina is named after, by the way, if you did not know that. And he, over there, they welcomed him with open arms. After 10 years or 7 years there, he came back to Mecca, they welcomed him with open arms, and Islam had basically spread throughout all around Mecca. The Meccans were all of a sudden felt like they were the only ones left. So he came back. So no bloodshed, no terrifying conquest. By his death, basically just the Arabian Peninsula, what you would call today the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, that area was Muslim, but nowhere else. And so that image down there, the gold one, that is his name in Arabic on a golden piece of art. And then that picture on the top is the door of that black cube building in Mecca called the Kaaba. Yes?
What years was all this?
Excellent question. Sorry, I forgot to put the number. That's a great question. So he was born about 570, Common Era, and died 63 years later. So 632, roughly. Okay. So this is basically 600 years after Christ. This is at around the same time that after, I guess, the Byzantine split, I think, where the Roman Empire split into East and West. After that, he was followed by 4 rulers who were 4 of his closest companions. And between them, in 40 years, they spread Islam all the way from China to Spain, pretty much in just 40 years. Was there a question? Sorry. So basically, And a lot of these conquests were not bloodthirsty or anything like that. It was mostly Muslims were trying to find a path to spread Islam. They were not trying to force convert the population. So, for example, in my country, Egypt, the Romans were ruling, and the Romans had switched to what it would be the Catholic Church, and most of the populace was Coptic, which they still are today even. And so they actually wrote to the Muslim ruler and said, can you please help us against the Roman ruler? So when the Muslim army arrived at Egypt, they mostly just let him in, and the ruler fled from Alexandria. And so, for example, in Egypt, there was no bloodshed. And then when Muslims came into a country, they would build their own cities. They did not take over the communities of the local people. They would just simply live side by side with them. So Cairo, where I was born, the famous Cairo that you all hear about, was built by Muslims. It is not an ancient Egyptian city, for example, or unlike Alexandria, which is actually built by Alexander the Great, for example, from before Islam. Baghdad, Basra, all these names of the cities you hear about in Iraq, those are all built by the Arabs and Muslims. They were not built by the Persians, for example, who were in Iraq at the time. So after that, basically became dynasties. So even though you would think of it as Muslim rule, but this was a dynasty of kings, pretty much. It was not so it was very Muslim in flavor, but not necessarily righteous Muslim in teachings or practice. Just like you would look at, Christian kings in Europe in the 1700s. You know they're Christian, but you're not saying everything they're doing is informed by Christianity. And then the Crusades and the Mongol invasion were a big kind of milestone. This was around 1900, so 900, 1000 Common Era. First the Christians came, the Crusades 1 through 9, I think. We saw them from the other side, which is, who are these people who keep coming over, invading our land over and over and over? And after the Crusades stopped, and we were able to free, I think it took 130 years to kind of eventually remove the last Crusader outpost from Lebanon or Syria. Then the Mongols showed up, like 20 years later, and basically they flattened the Abbasid dynasty completely, and Baghdad, and when they sacked Baghdad was like the capital of knowledge in the world, and they destroyed it, and the library famously, and a bloodbath and all that stuff. And then it fractured after that. Became tinier kingdoms in Egypt, and Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and Morocco, and it was not really one necessarily kingdom. And then after that, Islam was just spreading on its own. So, for example, when I mentioned Timbuktu or Indonesia and the Philippines, those were merchants from East Africa and the Southern Arabia and India, just with boats, would arrive in Singapore and Indonesia for trade, coffee, whatever, and come back. And over time, these islands became Muslims. So the Philippines, for those of you who don't know, until I think the 1500s, until Magellan, they were actually a mostly Muslim island at that point. Yes, sir. I will repeat the question. The origins of the Sunni and Shiite conflict? Thank you. Okay, I will go ahead and say it for the record.
So a major factor in the Middle East politics right now, and politics and religion all one and the same, is the split between Shia and Sunni worshippers in the Muslim tradition. How did it happen? What does it mean? What's the impact now?
Excellent question. So back to my original open argument, this is history according to me, meaning, to his point, I'm a Sunni. So I am from the majority Sunnis. So Muslims have two big sects, Sunnis and Shiites. And to answer your question, the split happened around here. The split was about who should rule after Prophet Muhammad. There were two schools of thought. One said his family is holy and blessed, and they should rule. So he had no son, but he had a daughter. So they said her husband should rule, or her children should rule. And then the majority Muslim was like, no, we don't have dynasties, we don't have kings. We should just choose the righteous ruler every time. And that opinion won. So the first guided caliph was Abu Bakr, his best friend. The second one was Umar, his next best friend. The third one was Uthman, a good friend, and also all of them like well-known, well-liked leaders in the community. The fourth was Ali, his daughter's husband. He was a good person, righteous, everybody loved him, but now the two lines converged. And this is when the Sunni Shiite split happened after he died. Those who wanted the dynasty to continue were very angry that his son didn't take over. This family, this dynasty, were interested in power, so they were ruthless in suppressing the supporters of Ali's progeny. They killed his second son, they were brutal, and so Shiites till today feel that the majority Sunnis let them down, they should have stood up to these people and so forth. But that was an argument over who should rule after Prophet Muhammad. The interesting part is that for the majority of Shiites, the lineage they were following ended during this time. Meaning that the person, because every generation they would pick a successor of Prophet Muhammad from his lineage that is the leader, that should be the leader. That last one did not have children. So he disappeared with no children. So now they have a problem. They're like us. And so they are waiting. They say he went into occultation and they're waiting for him to come back. The political disagreement over who should rule feels tangential right now, given that everybody's a republic or whatever. However, over time, these two paths, they started developing different opinions of law, of this, of that, and over time, Shiites and Sunnis look somewhat different. So if you see a Shiite praying the 5 times a day, he will always have a piece of earth or natural, something natural to put his forehead on. Like I will recognize them because they'll have a pebble, or they will take out a piece of like a carpet made of grass or something like that to put their forehead. It's something they believe in, we don't, for example. So over time, little by little, there was so many differences. So today, for example, realistically, Iran is the only majority Shiite country that has its own rule. It's also the only theocracy in the world. What do I mean? So, for example, you'll say Saudi Arabia looks like a theocracy. No, it's not. Saudi Arabia is a king who does whatever the religious fanatics want from him or her, right? But he's a king. He can totally ignore them. That's like, for example, the current king right now in Saudi Arabia is very liberal. He stopped doing a lot of the things that the previous kings did, right? But Iran, no. Iran, actually, the supreme ruler is the Ayatollah, who's a clergy. He's a scholar. He doesn't have the power to rule. He doesn't say, you do, you don't, I'll form the cabinet. None of that. He has the power to overrule anybody else. He can stop a law in Congress. He can stop an executive order by the Minister of Defense. He can stop. He can't start, he can stop. So he has think of it as Supreme Court. He has veto power, whatever. So that's their society. This is how it's shaped up. But of course, over time, there were battles, there were crimes on one side against the other, on the other side against the first. And now there's just like a bit of wedge issues between them, that they feel that they can't coexist. But me, being a neutral observer watching them, they're picking the most righteous leader. Like this Ayatollah, how do they pick him? They pick the most righteous scholar, just like we used to pick the most righteous leader. So, but of course, I'm sure Iranian would Shiite, not as Iranian, a Shiite would strongly disagree with my oversimplification here. Sorry, I digress on there a little bit. So, that's history of the Muslim rule. This is the expansion. So, this is the time of Prophet Muhammad. This is the time, as I mentioned, of the 4 guided caliphs after him. This is the Umayyad dynasty, the first dynasty. You see, we went all the way to Andalusia, southern Spain. We were like this far away from Paris. We were talking about Paris earlier. And we got all the way to China, to Western China. And this is the Muslim world today. And I put that to show you that there's a lot of, dark green means the country is 90% Muslim, 80%, 70%. So, sorry I moved off the podium, but I have to point it. So, this is to show there's a lot of majority Muslim countries in which Muslims never ruled with an army. That's kind of the point of this slide. Okay, show you that Islam just spread naturally out of these countries to other countries simply by trade, by interactions, by living close to each other, and so forth. Okay. I'm going to skip this one. I did want to call out, for those of you who may not have considered it, there's a few things that came from the religion that impacted the rest of world civilization. It was very interesting. I'm not bragging to say, oh, Islam was the best religion, but this is kind of to help you think. So, for example, I mentioned about natural sciences. Because every Muslim is required to recite some Quran during prayers, when we're standing in prayer at the beginning, we say some Quran. So every individual needs to learn how to read and write the script. So Arabic is like a musical note, meaning I can teach you how to read and write the script without understanding Arabic. I can just sound it out, right? So Arabs are only 18% of the Muslims in the world, but all Muslims in the world can read the script. Why? Because of this requirement. But because of this requirement, it also meant that the population had to be literate. So the majority of Muslims in the Muslim world at peak civilization were actually literate people, unlike most. You typically read about medieval times or whatever, only the king and the knights and the clergy knew how to read and write, everybody else did not know. That was not true for the Muslim world. Most of the population had to learn how to read the script to be able to recite the Quran. Something interesting. The other one is the Hajj, the pilgrimage that I described earlier. Imagine if every year people from all around the world got together in one place for a whole week and left. What happened in that 1 week? Yes, they worshipped God, they reenacted the life of Prophet Abraham, but what else did they do? They saw each other. So the Chinese person coming from China with paper showed it to the Senegalese person who left that same year with paper back to Senegal. So they started sharing inventions. And so inventions started spreading around the world much faster as a side consequence of the Hajj and the pilgrimage. Right? So that's an interesting angle of this. Checks, I don't know if any of you know, but if you look up the etymology of the word check, it's actually an Arabic word, sak, which means just a promissory note, like I'll pay you this amount, or you are owed this amount. If you go to this place, they'll pay you back. And it was a requirement of trade, because again, with this whole pilgrimage thing, the caravan system, what it was the caravan system? The caravan system is I'm leaving Yemen, I'm going to Syria to sell some beans. Coffee beans came from Yemen, if you don't know. And I'm on my way with the coffee beans. I don't have money. I go to a wealthy person in society and I say, can I please borrow your money? And then I go to the coffee grower and I say, here's your money, give me your crops. And I take the coffee and I go to Syria. I still don't have money, right? And I sell the coffee beans in Syria, and then I buy amazing silks from India that are in Damascus, and I take them with me and I come back to Yemen and I sell them there, and I take the money and I pay back the coffee guy, and I keep some money for myself, and I pay back the original investor. Right? And so all that was written by a promissory note. So the whole evolution of the checks. Hygiene, so Muslims are required to bathe once a week. Muslims are required to wash for every prayer of the 5 daily prayers. So there was a lot of emphasis on hygiene. So when the Crusaders came to fight the Muslims, they learned a lot about health and hygiene. They used to do weird things before that in treatment of illnesses and stuff. But Muslims had very scientific things like quarantine and all the stuff that they had learned from studying and from treating things openly without superstition in them. So when Richard III, famously, it was the 3rd or 4th crusade, got sick, Saladin sent his doctors and they helped him recover, and they taught his doctors how to care for the sick, for the sickness that he had, for example. So that's another one. Cool. This is History of Islam in America, and we are running out of time, so I will simply say that this is how Islam came to, I think it's an important for this audience, right? So we started coming around the 1500s with part of the Moors who were fleeing southern Spain around the same time that after Columbus had came to America and so on. So some Moors started establishing colonies in the 1500s. Most of them withered over time. Muslim countries were the first. Morocco was the first country to accept America's Declaration of Independence, FYI. African slaves were the next wave. They came in, obviously, late 1600s onward. About 30% of them were Muslim. And then Levantine. Levantine means Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan. They started coming. They have a more entrepreneurial culture on their side, so Phoenicians. So they started coming to America, establishing trade and so on in the 1800s. So like there are families in Illinois who date back all the way to the 1880s. For example, of Lebanese origin, Dearborn. Yes? Role of women. That's a great way to jump straight to this slide, to also move Tarek along faster on his presentation. So, overall, honored as a partner. So that's the thing, like this is verbatim the verse that talks about marriage in Islam. And he says, this is how God, not Prophet, God describes marriage, right? Among his signs, God, that he created spouses for you, from amongst yourselves, that you may find tranquility in them, and he made between you love and mercy. It's not about she cooks for you, it's not about whatever, like she's your maid. It's not about having babies. It is about finding comfort and tranquility and love and mercy. I think it's a beautiful verse, right? She's honored as a mother, honored as a daughter. She has the right to an education, the right to property, the right to work, all of those from 1400 years ago. This is not to say women don't have a problem. We do have issues in our societies, absolutely. But this is what the law says, right? So they're equal before God, meaning if a woman does a good deed, she gets 10 points. If a man does a good deed, he gets 10 points. It's not different. Before the law, if I kill a woman, literal official punishment is death or imprisonment. If I kill a man, same thing. If a woman sees a murder, her testimony is equal to a man. It's not any less before the law, which I think is stuff that matters, right? And then, as I mentioned, right to education, work, property, marriage, consent. You were talking about the story you mentioned about marriage consent. It is a foundational thing. So there's a lot of stereotypes around us, but the reason, and there is an emphasis on modesty, right? So in the religion, both genders are supposed to be modest, not just women. Both men and women are not supposed to wear anything tight-fitting, anything transparent, anything that draws attention to your body instead of your character and your person and your speech, right? And so that's on both sides. It's just that for women, the hair is seen as an article of beauty, whereas for men, not necessarily. And so, but putting that aside, there's definitely misogyny, there's definitely bias against women, there's definitely places where women are held back. I'm not denying any of that. Is it more or less than the West? More in some places, less in other places. Just my opinion. And this is just a teaser, because it's also a bit of a jaded picture. This is a slide from a Gallup study back in 2008 or 2010 that talks about the percentage of the richest and poorest people in society. Men, dark brown being women who make $2,000 or less. Next one is women who make $5,000 or more a month. And then men who make $2,000 or less, men who make $5,000. And this is the distribution society. It's almost evenly spread out, 25, 25, 25, 25. Almost. The men obviously have an advantage. There is a salary gap. There's no one denying that, right? But you see, this is across America. This is still America. These are Protestants, Catholics, Mormons, Jews, U.S. general population. So Muslims are actually doing better than the general population. I'm not trying to also portray a fake image, because this data is skewed by the fact that most Muslim women who come here are migrant workers. Like they have a degree, they have a CS degree. There's something that's not a reflection of all the women back there also. But it's just interesting. Like people sometimes look at Muslim in America, for example, and say, oh, poor women. A lot of actually Muslim women are pretty good in America, just for the record. I'll pause here and just open for questions. And you got to hand your hand up.
Go back to the previous slide. There was something in it. What does that mean? Where it says
honored as a mother. And then this is a tradition from Prophet Muhammad, where one man came to him and said, who is the person most worthy of my best companionship? He said, your mother. He said, okay, after her. He said, your mother. He said, okay, after her. He said, your mother. After her, he said, your father. To emphasize that you really, really should be absolutely kind and gentle to your mother.
What does it mean?
Hmm?
Where it says not even one contraction.
Yeah, well, these are brain teasers, so that you'd ask me these questions. So this one is more, a man came to him during pilgrimage, and he was carrying his mom on his back during the pilgrimage around Mecca. 7 cycles around the cube, and then you go up a hill and down another hill. And he was looking at the Prophet and said, have I paid her back? And he said, not even one contraction during birth. He said, you haven't paid her back for even one contraction. I see all the moms here nodding. So that's also the tradition. So I know we're over time. So yes, please.
Is probably confrontational
Please.
on how our homosexuals looked upon.
Did you sneak a peek at the... I have a slide for everything. Sorry. So how are treated is... So first of all, homosexuality itself is... so sex in Islam in general is within the framework of marriage. So sex outside of marriage, even straight sex or heterosexual sex, is forbidden in general. So homosexual sex is for sex. Having desires, having stirs in the heart, having curiosity, all that stuff is fine, it's just temptations. Acting on them by performing sex is seen as a sin. That has not really changed much, and there are liberal groups and progressive groups here in America who keep trying left and right, but the centrality of the Quran makes it very hard, because in the Quran it's not just, oh, Sodom and Gomorrah were bad nations, and they're not. It's actually literally says this deed is forbidden. It's very hard to navigate around that one. But of course, abusing them verbally or hurting them is obviously forbidden as well, of course. But that does not mean there's biases, obviously. Especially in the Muslim world, there are biases. You want me to wrap up? There was another hand back there. There. I can also pause and take questions offline if you want me to close. Sure, please go ahead.
Could you comment on the current business going on in Gaza now? What's the position of Islam on the October 7th
We were
activities and the
taking
response?
bets on whether it will come up or not. Please continue.
I'm sorry?
Please continue. Sorry, I'll tell you.
Do you have any comments on the role of Islam in the October 7th activities and the responses to it around the country, around the world, actually?
So, the role of Islam is that it is the religion that motivates, gives those people in Palestine hope and motivation. If they were Christians, I think they would still fight back. If they were... yes, sorry, I apologize. The role of Islam in the conflict in Israel and Palestine right now. And so my opinion is that the role of Islam is that it is the religion that powers Palestinians. They are 85, 90% Muslim, 15% Christian, by the way. People forget that the original OG Christians are over there. And so it is the religion that powers them. My implied answer in this is that's not the cause of the conflict, right? Sometimes it's portrayed that way in the West. Oh, it's Jews and Muslims, and they can't stand each other, and they fight each other, and they hate each other, and their religions tell them this. And I feel that's a simplistic, trivial view of the matter. Jews lived in the Muslim world for 1,300 years just fine, until the British Mandate came and started pushing Palestinians out to make room, and then that's after World War I, and then World War II established the State of Israel against, even in some lands that were supposed to be Palestinian, and then the war that happened right there pushed Palestinians even further out, and 900,000, nearly 1 million Palestinians were scattered into refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Egypt. Egypt does not have refugee camps. And so since then, they've basically been a people with dispossessed of land, dispossessed of status. Their country is not even recognized. So they're struggling for that, and I think Hamas is wrong. So just to be very clear, attacking civilians is wrong. But they're struggling for that in various forms. I think most of you remember the PLO, right? The Palestinian Liberation, and the kidnappings of the airplanes and all that weird stuff in the 70s, right? That was also a wrong way to fight for your cause. But they've been fighting for a long time. Before that, they waited for other countries to fight for them, like Egypt said, oh, we will intercede. Jordan said, we'll do this. Everybody's been promising to try and solve it, and they keep doing little. And in the meantime, they're still living in squalor on all these refugee camps, or stranded all over Europe and America and Canada and so on. So Islam is the fuel that gives them energy, just like a Christian oppressed will go back to Christianity as a source of strength and truth. I don't think it's the cause, if that answers your question. You good?
Do we have any more questions? We can take a little bit more time if you have any questions.
Please.
I think that was a really important question. And at the very beginning, you suggested that Islam sees all the religions as equal, whereas Christians, demonize Muslims. And I don't know about Jews. I'm not up on that. But we do know that in Palestine, Israel, there's a lot of animosity based on the religion. Hamas, however, is not necessarily a mainstream. Is it a mainstream Islamic faith? Because I understand that they come out of the Muslim Brotherhood, and there's a certain radical element to them. So how do you see that Muslim group in relation to the principles that you've talked to us about?
So Hamas is mainstream Islam in terms of their faith, creed, but that does not mean they're wrong, right? Just for example, you can have a Christian who does wrong things, and by approach, how many of you know what the Lord Alliance, what's it called? LRA, the Lord something army in Congo? Anybody heard of that? Oh yeah, okay. So that is a Christian group, by the way, and they're the ones who cut off the ears and the hands of the little kids, famously. When they fight another village or whatever, they literally maim the conquered. Anybody here recognize this as a teaching of Christianity? No, right? So right? Hamas is not like ISIS, where ISIS is completely a joke of what Islam even is. It's a cartoonish version of Islam, right? They're very brutal, they're graphic with their violence, toss people off a building, blah, 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 burn, whatever. They were trying to kind of like shock the world into submission. Hamas is more secretive, but they are a secret order. They're a secret organization. They're not like, it's not like they're on, Facebook, or they are kind of a secret resistant movement, and they suffer from what happens to secret movements in the shade, in the underground, right? Is that they become insular, they become kind of, and so yes, they teach a lot of rhetoric about like Jews in general are bad, Jews always believe this, Jews always do that. And they do have some people who listen to that in Palestine, but I think the majority of Palestinians, this is actually supported by polls and data, and I even have a nice book slide for those of you who like to read. This book by John Esposito is excellent. He's from Gallup. He's actually a Georgetown professor. He just retired this year, actually. And he did polling of Muslims all around the world, and he asked them all the famous George Bush questions. Why do they hate us? What's wrong with them? Them being the Muslims in the Muslim world. It's a great book, but polling actually shows that 80% of Palestinians want a peaceful solution to the conflict. They do not want war. They don't want an ongoing resistance and so forth. Any other? Yes, sir.
Microphone is coming.
This is the play-by-play.
Do you have any statistics? Do you have any statistics about the effect of Muslim religion in Seattle?
Oh. We definitely lost our NFL skills. I'm just joking about the Seahawks suffering of late. So if you're talking about the numbers, Muslims in Seattle are about 120,000 roughly. This is unofficial. We don't have great polling. It's not asked in the census, what religion are you, that kind of stuff. Other ethnic and religious Jews are very good at counting themselves. Other ethnic groups, for example, Latinos or Japanese Americans, are very good at counting themselves in other ways and outside of the system. We are not, unfortunately, as Muslims. But our estimates right now, when I worked in this nonprofit, he mentioned at the beginning is 120,000. What is the impact on them? I think they're split in kind of a half and half. One half is refugees, maybe more numbers. So Somalis, Iraqis, Bosnians, Cham. So since the 70s, different Muslim groups have been coming here. Seattle is an open refugee city, which we're grateful for. I belong to the second half, which is tech and professional. So since Boeing in the 60s, people have been coming here, settling down as families, because some of you may not know this, but everybody here is familiar with the Civil Rights Act, right? Anybody knows the Immigration Act? Shortly, but no, not the one that's not passing in Congress, the one that passed shortly after the Civil Rights Act during Martin Luther King's time. It was a result of the Civil Rights Act, which it flipped immigration to America. From before that law, white immigrants were favored over non-white. So if you're Italian, if you're Irish, you had a better, of course, Italians were not considered white. If you're of German, Swedish origin, you were welcome to America. If not, you were lower down the stack. After that law, it favored groups that are less represented in America. So Vietnamese started coming, Cham are Cambodians, and so on. And so this is when you started seeing Boeing hire people from, India and Egypt and so forth. And that's when the professional, this is where Dearborn, for example, became a lot of Arab families came there to work for Henry Ford, that kind of stuff. So that's the second community we have here, Amazon, Microsoft, Boeing, they contributed to that. But in terms of impact, are we making the city better or worse? I don't know. I hope better.
We've exceeded our time by quite a bit, so I think we're going to have to call it an evening. And Tarek, I want to thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you for having me. If you'd like to come by and ask questions afterwards.
And thank everyone for joining us this evening. And thank Risa for all her work. And good night to all.